So the topic today is the evolution of modern world order. In the past lectures, we have looked at the classical periods or the classical civilizations, particularly focusing on that of India, China, and Islam. We also brought in Greece and Rome as comparisons, points of comparison, and made the basic point that if you look at a lot of international relations theory today, ideas about world order today comes from Greece and Rome. Greece is seen as the birthplace for modern, democracy and anarchic international system, which is the relations among the Greek city-states. Rome is seen as the prototype or the ideal empire, is the source of concepts of empire. And so if you look at how a lot of Western international relations literature is written, they often go back to Greece and Rome and present them as having a universal and timeless relevance that comes up to the contemporary period. But we looked at also non-Western civilizations, which, if they are judged in terms of their own time and space, created world orders, which is not like the modern international system or relations between nation states, but world orders with their own world views, their own political institutions, and their own different types of interstate relationships, some of which would be anarchic, like without a centralized authority, like the Chinese warring states or the pre-Maurya Republic system of India. Or they can be also hierarchic, like empires, like the Maurya Empire, the Chinese imperial tributary system. And we also looked at how these civilizations, starting from the Sumerians, contributing to the idea of divine kingship, which is, in a sense, a more successful, longer-lasting political system than the Greek city-state system or the Greek polis or Greek democracy, which was really only a partial democracy judged by the modern form of democracy. We also saw the Indians contributing to ideas of both realist and moralist worldviews and policies. For example, the Kautilyan realism and Ashokan idealism. We looked at China contributing to realist concepts like legalism and idealistic concepts like Confucianism. China also had an anarchic system, warring states, and that made the transition to a hierarchic system after the creation of the Qin dynasty. We looked at Islam, and again, Islam was a bridge between the East and the West, in a sense, between the classical civilizations of Persia, India, and China, and the Western civilization that came after the Renaissance. Islam also was a bridge between Greece, Greek knowledge, and modern Western knowledge after Renaissance. Islamic translation of Greek texts, Greek knowledge, and its advancement of Greek knowledge really played a very important role in the flowering of the European Renaissance. So we also found that in all these civilizations, there were both rationalistic and non-rationalistic elements. No civilization was a monolith. They all believed, they were driven by the idea of divine creation or spiritual. They all had only a spiritual dimension or a mystical dimension rather than, and whereas we think the West or the Greeks only having overwhelmingly rational aspect to their civilization. Actually, in reality, all civilizations had a mix of rationalism and divine creation, or whatever you call it, divine causation. So if you bring all this in, this leads us to the contemporary what is called the modern period. It's useful to keep all these classical civilizations at the back of your mind before you discuss the so-called modern world order or a modern international system. So there are two major differences between the classical period and what we call the modern world order. First, this is a period of nation states. From 1648, Peace of Westphalia, we had really had a transition, major transition, kind of a more definitive transition, at least in Western Europe, from hierarchic systems to anarchic systems. And another major difference was this was the period of the rise of Europe. So this is really, in a sense, the European world order, emerging in Europe but going global through colonization and decolonization in the next few hundred years from the 16th, 17th century onwards. And that is the system that exists today. So we can actually begin to use the term international system more meaningfully because it is a system of nation states with sovereignty. However, we can also continue using our term for this course, world order, because as I said earlier, world order is a more or broader notion which includes both anarchic and hierarchic systems. So let's look at the evolution of the modern world order, which coincided with the rise of Europe and the birth of the nation state. So the first major event here is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the authority of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire over the German states. So Peace of Westphalia settled what is called the 30 Years' War, which was a conflict between, let's simply stated, Protestants and Catholics for the control of the political and religious control of Europe, but particularly the area that we call Germany. So until then, while there were very powerful kings and queens and various kinds of hierarchical systems, none of them were absolutely sovereign, at least theoretically speaking. They were all subordinate to the authority of the Pope, because the Pope was the supreme religious authority of all the Christians. Even though Christianity was fragmented into Catholicism and Protestantism and various other sects, but the Pope was the head of Christianity. And all the rulers, nominally at least, had to pay allegiance to the Pope. Now, since the collapse of the Roman Empire, at least the Western Roman Empire in Rome, and then the Roman Empire moves to the east to Constantinople, the Roman Empire, Europe didn't have a real overarching empire. They had a number of kingdoms and smaller empires, but all of them had to owe their allegiance to the Pope. And then there was this thing called Holy Roman Empire. It was kind of an imaginary empire. It was kind of supposed to be the leftover of the Roman Empire, assuming that this was a continuation of the Roman Empire, which had really collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantium, was nowhere as powerful as the original Roman Empire. So the idea of a Holy Roman Empire is the fiction that somehow the Roman Empire continues, or maybe one day will return to its former glory. And while the position of the Holy Roman Emperor shifted, but it was basically a Germanic concept. So it stayed within Germanic states. I mean, sometimes it went to other places like Spain, but it's really a state in that Western European region as kind of a legacy or a fictional successor to the Roman Empire. So the sovereigns of Europe had to obey, theoretically, or owe their allegiance to Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, even if the Holy Roman Empire had no power. In fact, it is said that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor much of an empire. It was more very Germanic. It really didn't have any significant territorial control, and it was not really very holy because the holiness resided with the Pope. But theoretically, this is very important because no state in Europe theoretically was the master of its own destiny. And that's what the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, was about. So a fight over the control, the political and spiritual control of Europe between Protestants and Catholics, between German princes who were Protestants and the Catholic Church, which also had its own supporters among the rulers of Central and Western Europe. So when that 30 years war ended with the Peace of Westphalia, it's a series of peace treaties that ended the war, and overall we call it the Peace of Westphalia. It ended the formal authority of Pope. It did not abolish papacy or the Holy Roman Empire. It simply stipulated that from now on, the rulers of Europe do not have to look up and obey the authority of a higher body, whether it's the papacy or the Holy Roman Empire. That created the model of the sovereign state. Sovereignty here has two dimensions, external and internal. Internally, the ruler, the king or queen or small emperor, has total allegiance of his or her subjects. So, within the domain of the ruler is politically supreme. So nobody can interfere in the internal affairs of the king, queen. Externally, sovereignty meant that there is no higher authority above the ruler. So that basically created the idea of state, and later on with the rise of evolution of nationalism and reorganization of states in Europe, the number of states in Europe declined because they are all getting centralized. So the idea of organizing states on the basis of nationality became important. So German states, although they didn't formally unify until much later, but states became bigger and bigger and absorbing the same nationalities, same ethnic groups, and becoming a little more homogeneous. And the number of states in Europe declined and giving way to the rise of stronger states and eventually empires. But the key point is that these states had total control over their own population, and they did not have, the population of these countries did not have to obey anyone except their ruler, and there's no higher authority above these states. That's the idea of the sovereign state, which was really a major contribution of Europe, or what I call the European world order. So if you might say that before, the Sumerians had divine kingship, the Indians had their republics, then the Mauryan Empire, the Chinese had their warring states to the Qin dynasty. Well, Europe made a transition in a reverse way. It actually was more hierarchic, but then it becomes anarchic. Whereas the Chinese and Indians went from anarchy to empire, Europe actually went from sort of more hierarchical systems to an anarchical system. And the distinct contribution of Europe was the nation state, with sovereignty, and was secular because it no longer was beholden to the authority of the Pope or Holy Roman Empire. So nominally, at least, it was secular. And the states in the European or Westphalian system were legally equal, at least in theory, if not in practice. Now, that's, of course, all these are in theory. I mean, in reality, secularism, of course, many of these European states continue to have religious faith, continues to be guided by the papacy, and they're never really equal. I mean, you cannot think of equality between a country like France, or later on Prussia or Austria, and then the smaller states of Europe. And they were sovereign, but big powers, like they do today, always interfered in the internal affairs of small powers or small countries. And the Pope continued to interfere in the name of religious authority, but actually in the political affairs of small states. So it's not a kind of a dramatic break from the past. But the fact is that it did create a different system, different set of institutions, different set of norms, which was considered legitimate and universal in the sense that it could be applicable to all of at least the Western Europe. There were empires continued. So we had even the rise of even bigger empires. So we had, all these big empires of France, of Germany, and later on Prussia, later on unified Germany, of course Britain. But those empires, and Austria-Hungary, which actually had control a big swath of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But in the European, continental Europe, the idea of empire was, if not gone, but was delegitimized. The idea of empire outside of Europe was fine. So when the European countries expanded, colonized, this was not affected by the Westphalian system. The Westphalian system made no injunction on the ability or the right of a European country to acquire foreign empires. So Portugal could go and have an empire in Asia. Spain could go and have an empire in the New World. France could have an empire, and Britain could have an empire all over the world. That was not prohibited by Westphalia. It was what happened within Europe that was controlled or affected by the norms and institutions of Westphalia, where the idea of a sovereign, secular, legally equal system of nation states took hold, with limitations and qualifications, but that was the general principle. And that is, in a sense, the genesis of what we call the modern international system. That system remained in Europe, continued in Europe, and after decolonization, after the European empires collapsed or gave way to independent states in other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, and Middle East, that sovereign state system was applied or inherited or created in those newly independent countries. So the European state system became more international or more global, and that's what continues today. Now, one question that arises here is, how do you manage order in a decentered or decentralized sovereign state system? In a hierarchical system, an empire, you have a strong power, big power, that provides order. Like the Roman Empire controlled all of Mediterranean and provided for peace and security or order. Same for the Chinese. When the Qin dynasty created the first Chinese empire from warring states, the empire, or the emperor, the imperial system was responsible for order, or peace and security throughout the empire. Same for India. But how do you maintain order in a decentralized system when there's no empire, theoretically speaking? So the Europeans created a system which generally called the balance of power system, and a corollary to that, an evolution of that, was the concert of Europe. Now, the idea of balance of power means simply that no single country should be allowed to become a hegemon, rise above everybody else, which would be the case of an empire. So the nation-state system should remain as such, as is, decentralized. And if one country in that system tried to become preponderant or dominant, all other great powers in the system, not all, but at least several of them should join hands to bring it down. So hegemony should not be allowed. So balancing of power. Balance of power means an approximately equal distribution of power and maintaining it, and not allowing any single country to become preponderant. Balance. And the Europeans believed in the balance of power mechanism as a way of maintaining order and preventing an empire. Now, how do you create a balance? Well, you can do that through alliances. So if one country like France is becoming dominant, or trying to increase its power, like under Napoleon, then other great powers, like Britain and Russia, two other great powers in the system, they form an alliance against France, and they defeat France. So that's what they did to Napoleon. When Napoleon was trying to become the hegemon and started conquering smaller states and trying to create a hegemony of France. So he was defeated, and that led to a reorganization of Europe. But this can also happen if later on, when Germany was trying to be dominant, Britain and France and Russia will join hands to defeat Germany. That's what happened in the First World War and the Second World War. Same thing can apply to any power that tried to become preponderant. So balance of power could operate through creation of alliances among great powers who are opposed to the rising or aspiring hegemon. And some people argue, and in some cases it happened like that it's an automatic thing. You don't have to really manage it. You just, the principles are clear, no hegemony, but if somebody tried to break that rule, other powers will come together. It's like an automatic thing. You don't have to create an institution like a United Nations or something to do that. But sometimes you find that system is too ad hoc and maybe too late to create the balance of power or to restore the balance of power. If a country has a power has already started asserting its power and trying to become hegemon, by the time other powers get around to balancing it, it's too late. And that's what happened to Napoleon in the late 18th, early 19th century. Late 18th, early 19th century. And Napoleon had already conquered a chunk of Europe before Britain and Russia all came together. So it may be too late. It's ad hoc. So how do you prevent that and make a balance of power more manageable and prevent, rather react to the rise of hegemony? Well, you do that through a system of management. So instead of making the balance of power or leaving it to be automatic, you actually create what is called a managed balance of power system. And that is called the concert of powers. So from balance to concert. The balance is kind of assumed to be automatic, take hold in form of alliances. But concert is more like a organized way of managing that balance power. The principle and the goal is the same, preventing hegemony. But in balance, you have mainly bilateral or trilateral alliances, and you just play this game of checks and balances and prevent the rise of a hegemonic power. In concert, you lay down the rules from the beginning, and you create a system, multilateral system. A concert is a multilateral system, whereas a balance of power is a bilateral, it's managed through bilateral or trilateral alliances. A concert is a multilateral system where all the great powers join hands to prevent hegemony and manage the security or order of a particular region, in this case Europe. So this concept of power system really took off from the Congress of Vienna, which took place to decide the fate of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. When Napoleon was defeated, especially through a coalition led by Britain and Russia, and France was kind of defeated, what to do with Napoleon's empire? How do you restore order and keep Europe stable after this experience of Napoleon? So a congress called the Congress of Vienna was called in 1814, and it finished in 1815, and that created the system called concert of powers. It was basically a great power management system for Europe. Some of the principles of concert is that it's inclusive, it's multilateral, and it's guided by the principle of anti-hegemony. But one of the key aspects of this system is that no great power is excluded or humiliated. So remember, France under Napoleon was defeated. So it could have been humiliated completely. That means France is out from the great power. France is a great power, but it no longer has any role in the great power system, and would have been forced to pay reparations, which it was. But it could have been eliminated from the club, a membership. It could have been deprived of its membership in the great power club. But the concept of power doesn't operate like that. It brought France back. No empire, some reparations, but you still are a great power. But France, in this case, has to play a role in the management of the future stability of Europe. So in the concept, therefore, all great powers have a place on the table. No great power is humiliated or excluded, and all the great powers sit down together to manage the security or stability of the system. And they do that through multilateral cooperation, multilateral diplomacy, conferences like Congress of Vienna. So here we see a transition from a unmanaged or a kind of a automatic balance of power system to a managed balance of power system. And this is not just a one-off exceptional thing. If you look at modern United Nations today, it's the concept of power of principle still operates, because the United Nations has 5 great powers in the as permanent members of the UN Security Council. Those 5 countries really have, they are first among equals. So they are great powers, and they have the primary responsibility in that sense. They have vetoes, and they are the primary members of the UN peace and security system, which is proving to be a bit controversial now, especially who should be among the permanent 5. But the concept principle is the great powers have a special role, a privileged role in the management of order continues. This concept of powers actually proved to be fairly effective, at least for the first few decades after the Congress of Vienna, and at least towards the middle of the 19th century, until the Crimean War. But then it started weakening, and then finally it collapses, particularly with the rise of Germany, and Germany becomes unified in the 1870s under Bismarck, and Germany tries to become the hegemon, and that leads to First World War in 1914, and the concert system sort of collapses, fails to prevent hegemony and empire building in Europe. But until the mid-19th century, the concept was fairly effective. And even after the defeat of Germany in the First World War, when the victorious powers created the League of Nations, they actually kept the concert model. Just like we have the United Nations system, Permanent Five system in the United Nations, the League also had its own council, which was similar in composition. It gave the great powers a major role. But the League of Nations did not succeed. It was very short-lived. And then Germany rose again, this time under Hitler. And we had Second World War. After the Second World War, this time with very strong American involvement and leadership, the United Nations was created. And the concert power system is kept in the guise of the UN P5. So the concert of powers provided a model of multilateral diplomacy, multilateral management of international order or world order, which you have to keep in mind. But I would like to say that you can go back in history and see some parallels. And one striking parallel would be the Sumerian Egyptian Amarna system. I told you, in the middle of the second millennium BC, a bunch of countries, including Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Hatti, created what we call the Amarna system, where the great powers actually, those are the great powers of the classical period, they actually collectively managed order through correspondence, diplomacy, and coordination among themselves. Of course, that was a long time ago. And this is in the 19th century, 20th century, the system is different. But still, you can see the principle of multilateral management of order in a region or in the world does have other precedents. So that was the concert of powers. Then the next major phase in the evolution, actually, I shouldn't say next. It started with, in fact, predated Westphalia, but continued through the Westphalia and took off, accelerated, particularly in the 19th century, early to late 19th century, and then ended after the Second World War, was European expansion and colonization. Now, this is very important because I was talking about the European state system and expansion. And this colonization peaked in the early 20th century, where Europe not only overtook the rest of the world, particularly Asia, but went global. Through conquest and colonization, it created the first true global empire. Now, one of the most important things that happened, of course, was the eclipse of the major non-Western empires. At that time, non-European empires. So, India, the Mughal Empire, defeated, and Britain became the Lord of India. China was never totally colonized, but humiliated. The Qing dynasty through the Opium War and the Boxer Rebellion. Qing dynasty had make a number of concessions to colonial powers, especially giving them treaty ports, ceding Hong Kong, for example, to Britain. And it was not a formal colonization, it was a semi-colonial status, as Mao would put it later. China was a semi-colonial country. India was really a colonial country and a colonized country. And the Europeans then went to all over the world and to Africa, to the Middle East, and Asia. Now, Latin America was an exception to this, partly because Latin America, of course, the modern Latin American states were created by the empires of mainly Spain, but also Portugal in Brazil. And in the Caribbean, the British and the French also went in. And in North America, the Americans, the British and the French again, and to some extent the Spaniards, took over all the territories. The native population of Latin America were decimated, partly by colonial wars, but also because of diseases that the Europeans brought in. Because the Native Americans had no resistance to things like smallpox, for example, or cholera. They had not been linked to the rest of the world, where the Europeans and others had developed immunity against these diseases. The Native Americans, both in South and North America, including the population of the highly civilized Mayas and the Incas, they had no resistance. So they were decimated. 90% of these people died, of the native population died. And that plus the European conquest, the brutality of the European conquest, particularly in South America, but also in North America. The United States was created, and basically a kind of in a land grab system, taking over land from native Indians, pushing them to the interior, to the west, and then expanding to the west, and finally dispossessing them entirely from their land and completely marginalizing themselves. Because the native Indians of the United States, what is now United States, had a very sophisticated civilization, some of them at least. The Iroquois, for example, had a very sophisticated civilization which actually informed the framers, or the so-called founders of the American United States, or the American Constitution. The Incas and the Mayas, who had very sophisticated civilization, the Inca Empire at one point was among the most sophisticated, could have been also the largest non-Western empire of its time, and if not largest in overall size, but in terms of its capital, which is now in Peru. So the Incas and Mayas were decimated. The Native Americans of North America were decimated. So Europe takes over. In Asia, it's a little different because Asians already had strong empires. The Ottomans, the Indians, and the Chinese, the Mughal, and the Qing. So Europeans had to fight their way slowly, first through trade and then through political control. Initially, it was about trade. The British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the French East India Company went into Asia, first to India and then to Southeast Asia, and then later into China. And then slowly, wherever they could, they took over, both through a divide and rule strategy, supporting some local rulers against other, co-opting local rulers to their side, and then defeating the existing sort of rulers of those countries. So they took over India, and they defeated the Muslims. They semi-colonized China, and the Ottoman Empire continued but weakened substantially. The Ottomans, which actually had conquered most of what is today Eastern Central Europe, and went to the gates of Vienna before being held there and repulsed there, they remained independent, but their size and their power declined. So Europe takes off, and the East, which used to have the golden age of empires, it's a very vibrant, sophisticated trading system. India, China, very powerful economies of their time at that time, and they created a system of communication, very vibrant trade in the Indian Ocean, linking Arabian Peninsula, east coast of Africa, with India, to Southeast Asia, to China, all the way to Okinawa and Japan. That was disrupted because the European powers took over different nodes of this trade route, and they basically imposed their sphere of influence. So if we have to trade between India and say Indonesia, which was really open before, now India is controlled by the British, Indonesia is by the Dutch. So you have to get permission and pay tribute to each other, pay taxes or concessions to each other to be able to trade. Instead of a free open trade, you really had the Indian Ocean trade was fragmented, divided by different colonial powers. So whereas before, India and Southeast Asia traded freely, really, with each other by paying, of course, customs and duties in places like Malacca. And India's trade was very regional to Southeast Asia and to the Middle East. Now, India's trade was reoriented. India's main trading partner was not its neighbors, but Britain. Similarly, Indonesia's trade was not with its neighbors. Of course, there was no concept of Indonesia at that time. It was Java and Sumatra, and of course, the kingdom that was defeated by the small kingdoms of Java and Sumatra were controlled by the Europeans. But their trade was no longer with each other as much as to the Dutch, which controlled Indonesia. And trade was diverted. Instead of a regional trading system, we had the major trading countries of Asia trading with their European colonial masters. So the intra-regional trade network gets disrupted. That causes even more economic stress on these countries. Africa was another case, a little different, even more kind of dramatic case of disruption, if that's possible. Africa was a source of slaves for both South America, the Spaniard, European powers in South America, and the European powers in North America. Africa provided slaves, and the slave trade was a major reason for the prosperity of those European settlers in North and South America, and later on, of course, the European-derived states. And then Africa in the 19th century, at the Congress of Berlin, gets divided. It's kind of a late comer in the empire, because initially the European powers take over North and South America and Asia. And Africa was kind of an unexplored area. There were, of course, European posts on the coast, and of course, South Africa was first under Dutch and then British. The interior of Africa was kind of a ungoverned at that time. But in the Congress of Berlin, Africa is divided among all the European powers. And it becomes fully colonized, even more tragically than other parts of the world. What happened to Latin America? Latin America was under, of course, most of it was Spanish, and then with the exception of Brazil, which was Portuguese, and the Caribbean countries and the Caribbean coast of South America, there were other powers like Britain, France, and Dutch and the others. But those population, the native population of all the Americas is gone, decimated by disease, by conquest, by brutality. So these countries are basically settler countries. They're settled by European population. And of course, there's a lot of intermixing, especially South America, not in North America, where the British never really believed in, intermarriages or getting absorbed in the native population. But in South America, the Spaniards really had a different approach to the native population. So after, conquering them in one way or the other, there were a lot of intermarriages and intermixing. So it's a more mixed population, but still they were of European heritage. The ideas and institutions were European. So they were the first to gain independence from Spain and Portugal. And they were kind of a little ahead of the post-colonial states in Asia and Africa. So Asian countries became independent only in the early 20th century, middle 20th century. Africa, even a little later, from the 1950s and 60s and 70s. But Latin American countries had become independent as settler countries in the 19th century. And United States, as you know, American Revolution, it's basically created the independent United States of America, 1789, and 18th century. So these countries were a little different in decolonization. And while the United States and Canada becomes independent much later, it was a British crown colony for a long time, these countries become part of the West because they are basically, white people settling both in North America, United States and Canada, from Mexico onwards, through Latin America. They're a much more mixed population, and they, in that sense, did not identify with the West in the same way. They're kind of in between the West and the non-Western culture. So if I put it crudely, there were a bit of native element that they identified with the global South or the Third World later. Whereas the United States and Canada would never identify with the Third World or global South. But the Spanish countries do. The Spanish former colonies of Spain and Portugal do. The Brazilians and the Mexicans, they identify themselves as part of the Third World, in the same way as India or Indonesia did. So we have, therefore, kind of a major shift in world politics. Colonization and later decolonization does several things. First, it coincides, or it sort of accelerates the rise of the West or Europe, creates the European world order, physically speaking, and through colonial control, either direct or indirect, in this case of China. And second, economic dominance. Trade, the pre-colonial trade, which is very vibrant in places like the Indian Ocean, now becomes fragmented. And the advantage passes from the local, regional countries to the European countries, because they control the trade. And the third thing that happens, as this happens, the process of decolonization starts first in the Latin American countries, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies there, then in Asia, and then in Africa and the Middle East. Middle East and Asia kind of decolonized about the same time. The middle part, or basically the middle part of the 20th century. They sort of inherit political systems, institutions, and norms and principles that were derived from the European state system, which means they become part of this Westphalian system. So Westphalia goes global. So before that, of course, these countries, these civilizations had different political systems, although a lot of them had empires, but different types of empires. And in Africa, there was tribal kingdoms or chiefdoms and the like. And the Mayas and Incas had their empire, and in some cases, the concept like Indonesia did not even exist. Indonesia was created as a nation state by the Dutch. But after decolonization, they all inherited the principle of Westphalia. They also aspired to be, or they became nation states. They also had the institution of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and legal equality of states. Even though previously they didn't have these institutions and norms, they were more hierarchical systems, at least for a long time. So Westphalia becomes global. The problem is that some of these concepts like territorial integrity, sovereignty, equality of states, they were kind of alien concepts in many ways, imposed on civilizations and societies by the European powers, and they didn't fit. And in many cases, we had a mismatch. Like you create, like India had a lot of different small kingdoms, even at the time of the Mongol Empire. You bring them all and call it India, and then divide India into India and Pakistan. And of course, you will find the problem is that there's no coincidence between ethnic groups and the boundary of the state. So India becomes multinational, a country, nation state with many nations. Indonesia also dozens and dozens of languages, ethnic groups, and they are brought into the system of a framework of nation states. So Indonesia also become a state with many nations inside. So you have states with many nations, and you also have the same nationalities or ethnic groups living across different states, as would be in Africa. Africa had no concept of modern territorial boundary, and people used to move across African kingdoms and chiefdoms before, and now they were, boundaries had been drawn, and therefore you have the same ethnic group living across different sort of so-called nation states. So you have states with many nations, and the same nation living across several states. That creates a fundamental problem of conflict. In fact, if you look at the source of insecurity in many parts of the world today, it goes back to that system. The expansion of Westphalia and the imposition of a nation-state system on civilizations or societies which did not have this fixedly marked boundaries and the idea of national sovereignty. So some of these new states, of course, they accepted Westphalia because it's important. I mean, what else can you do? You cannot go back to the pre-colonial period. So they accepted because they all wanted their independence. So they all loved having sovereignty. But with sovereignty came this nation-state concept, and the problem was managing the security in that sense. If you look at the conflict of India-Pakistan, India-China, Malaysia, Indonesia in the 1960s, a lot of that are legacies of the post-colonial boundaries, which are arbitrary. Technically, these countries accepted this. So Africa, for example, African countries decided after they became independent in the 1960s, they decided that these colonial boundaries, imposed boundaries, are bad and arbitrary, but changing them is even going to be worse. So we have to live with what we have. So the sanctity of colonial imposed boundaries was accepted as a norm in Africa and other parts of the world, in Latin America as well, but didn't work well in practice. And that's why the European world order, which expanded to the rest of the world through colonization and decolonization, didn't really, it created a global system, global world order, so to speak, but it didn't really work well in practice, and which is one reason why we have a lot of disorders, a lot of wars and conflicts, especially internal conflicts and ethnic conflicts in the so-called Third World or Global South after World War II. So when you look at violence and conflict, and this goes to the idea of security. In the Global South, the post-colonial world, the main problem of security is internal, not external, not like a World War I or World II, European war between states. A lot of the wars are internal, at least in their origin. They might expand and become external later. We will talk about this when we talk about global security. But that is kind of the foundation of insecurity in the modern times. So the European system, therefore, to make a number of contributions for modern international relations. It created the sovereign state system, or the idea of a decentralized anarchic system of sovereign, secular, legally equal, at least theoretically, nation states. It created the first global international order. It was the most extensive international system ever created, bigger than the Roman Empire, bigger than the Chinese Empire, bigger than anything Indians or Muslims created. All the different European powers controlled this, but the European norms created within Europe were extended, and communication links were created by these colonial powers, disrupting traditional links, but still creating a communication link that linked these various colonies to Europe. So that created a system of globalization, which we will talk about when we talk about political economy, global political economy. And then the European system also creates the prototype of institutions, like the concept of power system which is adopted by the League of Nations and then the United Nations. And the system of global governance kind of germinates from there. The Europeans also, going back a step on political economy, the Europeans also create their own form of globalization. Now, previously, we have seen that globalization was created really by the Chinese and the Muslims, really, with several strong contribution from the Indians and the Southeast Asians. So, Silk Road, kind of a communication between Asia and Europe, overland through Eurasia. The Muslim Arabs did something similar on the maritime space from Spain to Indonesia via India. And in Indian Ocean, where India was a major trading player, was also very vibrant. It combined Chinese, Muslim or Arab, and Hindu or Indian trading networks. And Southeast Asia was kind of at the heart of it. Malacca was a most important point of trade in the Indian Ocean, so that it was comparable, even exceeded the importance of Venice in the larger international context of in the 15th century. So the Portuguese writer Barbosa once said, after Portuguese took over Malacca in 1511, whoever controls Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. Because without Malacca, without the spices, without the spice trade that passed to Malacca, Venice would not be an important trading center. Whereas Venice was kind of one of the most important trading centers of the post-medieval or early modern period. Anyway, the Europeans create their globalization, even though they are not the founders of globalization. But the European globalization is Eurocentric, whereas the previous globalization created by the Chinese, Indians, and the Muslims are a combination of all of them, with contribution from the Mongols. Mongol Empire is often seen as a kind of a disruptor. And it was in many ways. It destroyed the Caliphate of Baghdad. It took over China, the Yuan dynasty. So it finished off the Songs, the southern Song dynasty. The Mongols also went all the way to Europe. They invaded parts of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, and they destroyed the Pagan kingdom, for example. What is Bagan today? Myanmar's most historic kingdom. But Mongols are also creators and unifiers. They created a centralized kind of a communication system, transport system. We talk about the Belt and Road. The Mongols would have been kind of precursors to the Belt and Road. They pacified vast chunks of Eurasia and imposed, kind of standardized and a kind of a interlinked system of communication and trade over Eurasia. And they pacified it, meaning they created peace and stability in that area. So Mongols also played their role in globalization. But the Europeans come in, all this moves to Europe. Europe is the center. It's a Eurocentric globalization. And it is not as decentered. Previously, you have several nodes, for example, in the globalization. You have Muslims controlling the sea route, the Indians playing a very important role, not controlling physically, but the active traders and in Indian Ocean. The Chinese, of course, are having the tributary system, allowing trade from Southeast Asia, India, and other parts of the world, Northeast Asia, to come to China. And Southeast Asia, supplier of the most important commodity of this period, spices. And Southeast Asia also linked up. So this is decentralized. So Malacca was important, Guangzhou was important, India's Gujarat Coromandel coast and the Malabar coast was important, Aden was important. There are several nodes. It's a much more decentered, much more open system. When the Europeans came in, they all had their own. Europe was the center generally, but Europeans also fragmented. So the globalization shifted to being managed by Europe in a more central way, with a handful of European countries like Britain, for example, France, Netherlands, and Amsterdam and Rotterdam being big ports. Sorry, Rotterdam being the big port in Europe. So it becomes different. And it's also far more exploitative. The European globalization is accompanied by conquest. This is more similar to Hellenization rather than to Indianization. The European globalization is fueled by slave trade. Of course, slavery existed everywhere. From the Roman Empire and the Persians did not have kind of this formal aggressive system of slavery, but slavery has been around for a long time. But the Europeans systematically used for their own expansion and dominance. And so conquest, warfare, slavery, and also disrupting intra-regional routes and creating the route connectivity with Europe as opposed to within regions were the legacies of European globalization. Globalization and violence, globalization and slavery went hand in hand. Now, I'm not trying to belittle Europe and glorify the Oriental globalization, but it is different, and certainly the scale of violence and slavery and also globalization of disease, which really came with Europeans, is unprecedented. So though Europe creates the global system, really globalization, but it also comes at the cost of slavery, violence, and spread of disease. And no civilization exemplifies this more graphically than the Mayas and the Incas. When the Maya civilization and the Inca civilization in the Andes, the Maya civilization in contemporary Mexico, Guatemala area are defeated by the Spanish, they just disappear. And silver from the Inca civilization, from Peru in particular, going through Panama, comes to Philippines, and then goes to China. The Europeans create that kind of a Pacific route of globalization. The Europeans depended, the Spanish expansion depended on silver from the Inca civilization, which has been decimated. And that goes to the Pacific, to Manila, and from Manila to eastern China. And that sort of finances Chinese expenditures of the Yuan dynasty and later on, of course, the Mings. And it creates new vulnerabilities of China. You might think it's good for China, but it kind of creates Chinese dependence on silver. And if you read about the extraction of silver from today, it's Peru, from the Inca civilization, it's just horrific. It's the single most brutal account, inhuman account of resource extraction that I have read anywhere in the world. Of course, resource extraction is always bad for the native population, but the cruelty, the barbarism of this beats anything else that I have read. So you could take a look at this and find out for yourself that Cusco, which was the center of the Inca silver trade after the Spanish came in, just was the most brutal, wretched place on earth during that time. So globalization, we think, is good, and all I'm trying to say, it had previous roots in the Orient, Silk Road, and Indian Ocean. Europeans created a more global system of globalization, so to speak, but it came at the cost of disease, slavery, and conflict, or it was created on the back of disease, slavery, and conflict. Then we come to the American leadership, or the American world order. Are we done with the class? We still have time. Okay. Okay. So the American civilization, I'll talk about this a little more detail later. But the United States emerges as a rising power in the early 20th century. But initially, the United States focuses its attention only in its own immediate neighborhood. That would be Central America and the Caribbean. So that becomes an American leg. So the United States' main goal during that time is to push out other European colonial powers, push out the French, push out the Spaniards, push out the British. They couldn't do that very successfully in Canada. The British have a very strong presence in Canada, and the British forces in Canada actually defeated and burned down the White House, American forces in the War of 1812. But in the rest of it, through a series of purchases like the Louisiana Purchase, the defeat of the Mexico, which then led to United States grabbing Texas and pushing the Spaniards out of from the Caribbean and Central America. United States establishes its initial position as an empire. Now, you hear a lot about the United States not being an empire. It's not true. It is an empire, but it also used different type of systems. It purchased Louisiana, but it also took over Texas from Mexico, and it had this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe promulgated basically a Monroe Doctrine, which essentially meant the Central American Caribbean is an exclusive sphere of influence of the United States. No other power, especially these European powers who were there before, like Spaniards and French and the British, could actually have a significant presence or role. With some exceptions, they can have small colonies like in the Caribbean, for example. But if the United States remains the dominant power, the United States will interfere to exclude these powers from this region, create a sphere of influence. And later on, it expanded to also the ability or the right the United States claimed for itself to intervene in the political internal affairs of all the states, including the the states that got independence from Spanish. The United States reserved for itself the right to intervene in the affairs to keep them under American control. And there is a history of U.S. invasion throughout Latin America, Caribbean, and Central America, which continued to the 20th century. For example, the invasion of Panama, for example. So what we're talking about is that the United States starts as a rising power, and it was not a peaceful rise in any sense. It's not all this nice and sort of a benign story. The United States is a bastion of liberty, equality, fraternity. It inherited ideals from the French Revolution like that, and it's a shining. It's a beacon to the rest of the world. I mean, that part of it, that narrative is maybe true. It's an immigrant country. It was at that time, and it did provide liberty for its citizens. But its rise was accompanied by brutal force, starting with in North America itself, the expansion of the early colonial settler colonies into the West, and further west, the westward expansion of the United States, and then through purchase and conquest, getting states like Louisiana and Texas. Then around that, creating the Monroe Doctrine of a sphere of exclusion in Central America and the Caribbean. And of course, later on, formal colonialism. Haiti, Philippines. The United States takes over Philippines in the late 19th century. And as a colonial power, and of course we can talk about Guam, Hawaii, and other places. So all I'm saying is that the United States is not the same as a European power, but it was also, its expansion was accompanied by some of the United States of slavery, and that's why we had the Civil War. And the United States expanded through conflict and intervention and exploitation by trade. So somehow there is a narrative in international relations. The United States is different from the Europeans. The American world order was different from the European world order. The American world order was based on multilateralism, principles of liberty, justice, and equality, whereas The European world order was basically colonialism and these other things, slavery and other things. But there was a continuity between the European and the American world order. And that's what I'm trying to highlight here. Of course, the United States, that's what I call American world order, created up in 1945, was different in some ways. So where the Europeans managed security in order to balance of power and concert of power. And concert of power is simply a managed balance of power. The United States really resorted to full-scale multilateralism. So the hallmark of the institutional hallmark of the American world order is the multilateral institutions, the UN system, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which became the WTO later. So where the Europe manages order to balance the power, either automatic or this multilateral concept of organized through the concert, the United States nominally goes for full-scale multilateralism. So that's why a lot of people think global governance and multilateralism is an distinctly American contribution. John Ruggie, a professor from Columbia, now in Harvard, edited a famous book where he argued, in that edited book in his introduction, that multilateralism is a quintessential American institution. There's no multilateralism. America invented it. There was no real multilateralism before. Under the Germans, for example, or the Japanese, they created spheres of influence. The Russians, the Europeans, and Japanese created spheres of influence. The United States actually created the institution of multilateralism. But that's true. But there may be a system of discontinuity. But you have to remember two things. A lot of these multilateral institutions are dominated by the U.S. The United States gave itself a privileged role. And secondly, behind this facade of multilateralism, there are all sorts of continuities between the European and American world order. Earlier it was slavery, but through the 20th century it was the Monroe Doctrine over Central America and the Caribbean, and also kind of an attitude towards the rest of the world, where American primacy and American dominance, American intervention throughout the global third world and the global south. So that sort of gives you a sense of continuity. Now, I haven't talked much about Japan since we're talking about Japan was an important country. When we had the colonial expansion of colonialism, and as I said earlier, India was a colony, China was a semi-colony. What about Japan? Japan was the only country that escaped from this because of the Meiji Restoration and the restoration of the Japanese monarchy and the abolition of the shogun system, the Tokugawa shogunate, and also the samurai system. Japan modernized, but modernization here meant emulating the West. So Western-style industrialization, infrastructure, but also Western-style diplomacy. There's something called a standard of civilization. The Europeans had a standard of civilization, which is not a cultural concept. It is actually a geopolitical concept. What standard of civilization meant was that to be considered civilized, which meant to be left alone and recognized as an independent, equal country, to be part of this European Westphalian system, you must not only modernize, but you must also have similar norms and institutions and principles as the Europeans. You must be able to honor your treaty commitments. You must be able to order peace and security in your territory. And you must be also able to manage or participate in the management of balance of power. So Japan takes this to heart. And Japan therefore participates in the Boxer Rebellion along the sides of the Western forces. Japan then expands. Colonialism becomes part of this standard of civilization. Japan becomes a colonial power. After defeating Russia, Japan gets even added prestige. And it was in a sense, ironic, because when Japan defeated Russia in the war, the Russo-Japanese War, a lot of Asian countries and nationalists were very happy. They were inspired. This is the first time that they know an Asian country has defeated an European country. So that gave inspiration to a lot of nationalist movements throughout Asia. But then soon Japan turned against its neighbors and in the name of Pan-Asianism, it created its own sphere of influence. Even in China, leading to the occupation of Manchuria, and of course later on the Nanjing massacre and the like. And Japan also created the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, basically a sphere of influence, colonial concept, and then outright colonialism, conquest and colonialism, through China, through all the way to Burma, and Indonesia, Singapore, Malaya, Vietnam, you name it. So in a sense, Japan was emulating Europe to be part of a civilized group of nations, and the European standard of civilization was, in essence, a political, geopolitical concept. You must be like Europe, both in your domestic and international relations, domestic power and international relations. You don't have to be a democracy there, because Europe itself was not really that democratic. But at least you should have a stable political system at home. And internationally, you must be able to have a foreign policy that respects not only treaties, but also participates in the pacification of your neighbors and the other countries. Manage the sort of peace and order. You should be able to contribute to peace and order in your region or the world. And Japan learns that, and in the same way as Europe becomes an imperial country. So that means Japan is an exception to the rest of it, but then, you know the story, Japan is defeated in the Second World War and becomes part of the American world order. So go back to the American world order then. The United States creates the world order, nominally multilateral, but dominated by the United States. It has inherited the attributes of, as it rose. Before the Second World War, the American world order came about. The United States rose through also slavery, through intervention, through outright colonialism. But after 1945, the United States created a multilateral system which provides benefits like free trade. The United States advocates free trade. Originally, free trade was directed against the British. The United States wanted to get access to markets that were dominated by the British and other colonial powers. But then it creates a system of rule-based trade. And in institutions like the UN, but behind this is the concept of the force of American hegemony. United States is the number one economy, number one military power in the world, and creates the world what today we call liberal order. And it was really not all that liberal when it comes to the entire world. It included intervention, included empire, and included the practice of the Monroe Doctrine or sphere of influence, even after 1945. But that continues until, I guess, the early 21st century. And there's a lot more to this that we should talk about later. But that is American world order. Some continuities, important continuities, the European world order. United States, by the way, retains the sovereign system. It believes in state sovereignty, especially for itself. And it talks about multilateralism, but when it comes to East Asia, no multilateralism in the region. Bilateralism. So U.S.-Japan alliance, bilateral. U.S.-South Korea alliance, U.S. Republic of China alliance, U.S. Philippines, U.S. Thailand. So a mix of bilateralism and multilateralism, and the practice of free trade, but with United States calling the shots and creating trade rules. So that's basically what we have had from 1945. It started declining towards the end of the 20th century, and I believe, not everybody agree with me, has declined and is ending today. I wrote a book called The End of American World Order, and that basically tells you the story of its decline. And it came out before Donald Trump was elected. So I argued that the liberal international order, which is basically what I call American world order, is coming to an end. And this was well before Trump was elected. And that time, many Westerners did not buy this idea, but after Trump was elected, my book was published in 2014. In 2016, everybody is talking about the end of the liberal order. So let me just stop here, and we'll take up some questions and follow up some of these ideas later on.